Welcome to Practice Disrupted, a podcast where we find ways to create new solutions to current challenges while elevating the value of architects. I'm your host, Evelyn Lee, an architect who spans tech as an angel investor, startup advisor, and founder of Practice of Architecture. Whether you're a seasoned architect or just starting in the field, this podcast is your gateway to think differently about the role architects play within our global community. Hello, Disruptors. Welcome to this week's episode of Practice Disrupted. Today, we're diving into the intersection of architecture, planning, and civic leadership with someone who has dedicated his career to shaping more equitable cities. Rico Quirindongo is the Director of Office of Planning and Community Development for the City of Seattle, a role he transitioned into after nearly 3 decades in architectural practice. His journey is one of passion, persistence, and purpose. From leading impact design projects to now influencing policy at the city level, Rico is redefining what it means to be an architect in public service. In this episode, we'll talk about his path from traditional practice to city leadership, how architects can influence urban policy, and why he believes design thinking is critical to shaping thriving communities. Let's explore his journey. Rico, welcome to Practice Disrupted. I am so grateful for you to spend your time with us today. You're somebody that I've been wanting to bring on for a while, and I appreciate your enthusiasm and just commitment both to the profession, but also your community as an architect, as I've seen you progress over your career. Welcome to Practice Disrupted.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Before we talk about your career path, I thought it might be good to introduce our listeners to kind of what it is that you do now. So why don't we start there?
Sure. So I was a practicing architect for 27 years. And then 4 years ago, months after the tragedy of George Floyd, I got an email and then a phone call from the previous mayor of the city of Seattle, ultimately asking me to join her cabinet. That began 4 months of conversation around like what that meant and like what position would I take and all of that. But ultimately, I became the deputy and then the interim director of the Office of Planning and Community Development for the city of Seattle. And that position of director I have now had for 4 years. So I worked for the previous administration for a year. I have now worked for the new administration for the last 3 years. So I was retained and my position was made official. Ironically, I was interested in holding the position of Director of Office of Planning and Community Development when the position was created and put out for consideration around 8 years ago. And I actually applied. The previous mayor, Mayor Durkin, could not have known that. I didn't make it past the first round. And Sam Asefa, who was my colleague and friend who held this position previously, he absolutely deserved it way more than I did because he'd done the position in other cities and was bringing that expertise to Seattle. I think that because of my connection to community and work across the city and with the county and with the state and regionally, it did make sense for me to move into the position. And the work that we do, connecting communities, doing community planning, we put out a equitable development initiative funding around $20 million a year for communities of color to do development and build generational wealth for BIPOC organizations that are providing social services for our communities of need and communities of color. We do a ton of just exciting work, as well as kind of the municipal level work that's required of all cities and counties. So we oversee the comprehensive plan for the city, which includes very typically a large land use action once every 10 years. And so we're actually engaged very heavily in that work right now.
That was going to be a lead into my next question, because I feel like even in architecture firms, right, when you come up with a job title. I feel when I hear the Office of Planning and Community Development, when I was getting my MPA and deciding what's next, always seemed like something I wanted to do. But then when I looked at the actual role and responsibilities, it actually varied, defined by the city. So in one city, for instance, it might be like a glorified overseeing the building planning, the building department effort. It seems to be a lot more strategic when it comes to the community in the city of Seattle.
Yeah, it is. It is hugely different from one city to the next. I actually am a part of the Lincoln Institute Big City Planners Institute, essentially. We get together once a year in the fall to kind of cross compare best practices and talk about the work that we're doing in so many large cities across the nation. And I have a staff of 50 people. I have colleagues that have a larger portfolio where they're involved, where they're responsible for permitting also, or they're involved in other jurisdictional requirements where they may have a staff of up to 300 people. I've been very interested to learn how different from one city to the next, how cities are administered. I think for Seattle, the creation, so we used to have a planning department which was underneath the permitting function of the city. So it was the Department of Planning and Development at the time. I believe it was 4 administrations ago now. The then mayor 10 years ago made a decision to break off the planning function of the city and have it be freestanding so that it could be more strategic and really lean into the cross coordination of all of our capital departments, which is one of our functions, as well as overseeing kind of a larger vision for the city. And how does built environment support kind of the health and well-being of the communities that we serve as a city. So that's been really refreshing to be able to lean into. Understanding, of course, that I have multiple bosses. My main boss, my main man is, of course, the mayor, Mayor Bruce Harrell. But I also, in a support capacity, provide staffing support for our 9 council members. And I also, in the work that we do, we support so many different stakeholders and constituents and organizations. So it's very challenging. It's a challenging job. I will leave it there for now. I've got lots of interesting stories.
I think when we come back full circle, let's think maybe there's an opportunity to tell those stories without getting yourself in trouble navigating any political waters. You opened the conversation by saying that you were in traditional practice for 27 years. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you were doing and whether or not that actually informed your relationship with the previous mayor who reached out to you?
Yeah, so I went to Washington University in St. Louis for my undergraduate, where I double majored in African American studies and in architecture. And I think that even then, my focus was around wanting to lean into how work in the built environment really has a positive or negative impact on communities, and really wanting to take the experience that we all have on a daily basis, the bus that we get on to go to work, the walking through our neighborhood, the storefront that we pass by when we're in our downtown center. Most people take all of those experiences for granted, but how we feel, our sense of well-being or our sense of place, is defined in large part by the built environment around us on a daily basis. And so I wanted to become a Black architect to elevate the importance and value of that to, a whole stakeholder group of like Black and brown people that really don't typically have the access to information, access to capital, access to relationships that inform how our neighborhoods grow, how they're invested in.
Did you grow up in St. Louis?
No, so I am a born and raised Seattleite. I actually grew up in a white suburb of Kirkland, Washington, where, like after being very much the minority in my junior high and high school, well, elementary school too, I needed to get as far away from that experience as I could. And I couldn't have known how informative moving to St. Louis for 5 years would be. But moving from a very affluent community in the Seattle area to kind of the blight of like haves and have-nots that is St. Louis, which, like, to be clear, in its heyday in the late 50s, early 60s, St. Louis was a larger city than city of Seattle is today. It was 850,000 people. City of Seattle is almost 800,000 people today. Now, St. Louis today is more like 370,000 people, which means it has very unique urban planning challenges. I was just there with a great group of planners, a bunch of folks from Germany, actually, that were doing a German-American exchange to talk about planning practices and how to get to better outcomes for all related to housing. But my greatest educational experience being in St. Louis for 5 years in undergraduate was just seeing, the site that was Pruitt-Igoe, the tearing down of like affordable housing that was just inhospitable, all the gated communities of white wealthy families, the lack of a tax base in downtown St. Louis, which ensured that, like, when people left their office towers and went back to their private communities, there was no investment in like civic infrastructure downtown. It very much has informed like the work that I do today and the work that I did as an architect for 27 years. I had the good fortune of being able to work with Donald King, who started a small Black-owned business, which when I joined was 10 people. I joined in 1996. He started that firm in 1985, and I helped him grow it to almost 30 people and worked for him for the better part of 17 years. Became a partner at the firm in 2008. But like our clients, we were doing affordable housing, working for the housing authorities. We were working for not-for-profits providing social services. We were doing public school work. And then we were doing essentially work for government agencies, whether that was city related or county related or at the state level. I even had the good fortune of being able to be project architect for a federal project out on the Yakima Indian Reservation, which was essentially a alternate to a youth correctional facility where young people, instead of getting sentenced to go to juvie hall, they would be sent out to this campus, frankly, in the middle of nowhere, where they would live, work, and learn.
I feel like there's more social models like that typically happen outside the US, but not necessarily within the US.
Yes, I think that's right. In all the work that I was able to do as an architect, this project included, what I've tried to find opportunities to lean into is projects where we could push the boundaries of traditional practice, not architecture, but like the practice of civic service. So just going back to that project in Yakima, that was an opportunity that the feds and the folks out on that reservation were creating for underserved youth of color to get to a better path in life and to be able to build the architecture that supported that, which in this case was the rooms that they stayed in and the bioswales that like collected water outside their bedrooms and like the entry alcoves and gathering spaces that those students frankly like lived in and benefited from while they were there. Like really, really important stuff. Will never be on the front page of Architecture magazine, but of my early work, like one of my proudest projects.
But changing more lives than a single family residence with an unlimited budget.
That's exactly right. So kind of to answer your question about the tie and segue to my work currently, after Donald and I had to close DKA, which was our architecture firm, I moved on to a large international firm, DLR Group, who I was with for 7 years and helped to grow their civic practice. And in that, I was able to bring a handful of projects that were civically focused, and among them, projects that were really a part of the fabric of city of Seattle as a place. So like one of my last projects was the conversion of the Seattle Coliseum on Seattle Center campus, which was built in 1962. I also have a background in both historic preservation and adaptive reuse, turning that 1962 facility into a 21st century entertainment and sports venue. So Climate Pledge Arena. It was a $250 million problem, like that the city didn't have the money to like continue to maintain or upgrade that facility. And it was a totally underutilized facility that was only had something like 30 events a year that happened in it. It turned into a $2 billion project. We were able to court and bring on board a new hockey team, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll also be able to bring back a basketball team to the city, Go Sonics. But like now, it's an amazing facility that is a part of the placemaking of, you know, our extended definition of downtown Seattle. And I love going there just to hang out, but it's a beautiful facility. It's a beautiful place. Why is this important to my transition? By the end of my like years of practice, all the work that I was doing was civically focused. And this was like one of the cherry on top projects that I was able to be a part of as the local architect. But I think that meant that I had built up a lot of relationships with decision makers at the city, as well as relationships with developers in the city that have a lot to do with how it has transformed over time and continue to make critical investments in how we continue to expand and grow. And so like making the transition into like the planning function of the city felt like a natural transition, and kind of being able to, instead of focusing on single site solutions, being able to hold a body of work where I am serving 800,000 people with a staff of 50 passionate, qualified, and invested staff that really do amazing work. On a weekly basis, I'm amazed at both the quality of work that we're able to do with a relatively small staff and our level of reach. Our portfolio is pretty large, actually.
Enjoying the show? Join a community of fellow disruptors at practiceofarchitecture.com/community. Your membership helps support the production of this podcast, Practice Disrupted, and funds the creation of more resources for all of you. Looking forward to growing together. Join us today at practiceofarchitecture.com/community. I want to talk a little bit about the move to the role that you have now. I think a lot of what architects struggle with when they are thinking about alternative paths, and even as you progress through leadership at a firm, running as a principal at a firm where you're overseeing a staff of up to 30 at a DKA, or even running a studio, is that you get away from like doing the actual design work. Did you find that you were more passionately engaged with the role you were growing into in those leadership roles and the relationships that you were forming? Or do you miss any of, I guess, what, the big A architects would qualify as doing architecture?
So it's a great question. Interestingly, I did have to go through a large transition period after taking this job where I did miss like doing traditional architecture. And oddly enough, like, the job I was just talking about, Climate Pledge Arena, I almost, so for I want to say it was 3.5 years, I think, that I worked on that project. The number of times that I put pen to paper in air quotes was maybe 1% of that time at best, which I also think made my transition into my current administrative role at the end of the day fairly straightforward. The politics, not so straightforward, but that's its own conversation. Well, actually, this is interesting because you brought up a really good point. So at DKA, I was second in command to Donald, and we had a staff of 30 that I was like a large part of, like overseeing that staff. And now I have a staff of 50 here. I will tell you that my leadership skills now are so much more refined and impactful than they ever were in 2008. And some of that's just simple experience, but like some of it's also an appreciation for the value of design through leadership beyond what is understood as traditional architecture. Now, I will totally cop to the fact that, like, two things. One, over the weekend, we had friends over to our house for late lunch, and they started a conversation around the house that they want to design out in the Methow Valley. And I'm like, hell yes, sign me up. You can take the boy out of architecture, but you can't take architecture out of the boy. I will always be excited for the opportunity to lean into like actual design problems. But two, and I know this is going to sound like a total cliche, but everything's a design problem. Most people don't see it that way, and I understand that. But in our schooling, in our profession, what we are taught is how to solve problems. Hierarchy of information, hierarchy of levels of communication and types of communication. How do you convey the information? What are the graphics associated with it? What's the high-level summary, high-level executive summary versus the information that needs to be doled out to the mechanical engineer, electrical engineer, interior design? And those same realities exist for me as it relates to what's the information that I need to deliver to council versus general public versus key stakeholders versus the mayor's office. It's about curating and managing information. I will tell you, like 4 years ago, our office was not like knocking it out of the park like we are today. You can go to our website and see video storytelling about the community partners that we work with and the development projects that they're working on and the services that they provide. You can see imagery related to our ideas around what the next level of land use is for the city and the map, the interactive maps. There's a graphic intelligence to the work, which is entirely about design and entirely designed. And it makes a big difference. We are better understood, better respected, engaged more regularly. I'm very proud of not only the work that we're doing, but like the fact that I get to do it as an architect. Like it is different. The work is different because of my background and my training.
Thank you for that. I mean, you're speaking to the choir when you say everything is a design problem. It is a cliche, but there's truth, right, to it. And I think that's how I approach what I do with my work too. It's all a design problem. Mine's just more numbers based than maybe others in a way. What's interesting to me is I use a lot of these architecture and conversations to talk about like how others might follow in your footsteps, or, you know, maybe there's a young listener out there that's like, I want to do what Rico is doing. So a few things. How many architects do you see when you gather that once a year in similar roles as you? And is there something as a young architect who like believes in licensure, for instance, or somebody like a young graduate who believes in licensure, like, is there a stepping stone to get through to there from traditional practice? So maybe take the first one first.
I want to say this straight out the gate. Licensure, super, super important. Even though I do not stamp drawings, having a license that I maintain, having continuing education that I maintain, very important to remaining competent, relevant, and responsible. So for anybody out there that's like interested in your background is in architecture and you're thinking about transitioning to like public service or community planning, I encourage it. And you still got to have your architecture license. Critical, important. Having said that, so I think that I have been told that I was uniquely focused as a younger person in architecture. I knew that I wanted to become an architect when I was in 11th grade, and kind of my focus on the idea of architecture to make people's lives better began as an undergraduate.
I mean, honestly, I think that insight, given your upbringing in white suburbia, is a huge step for most, because you also didn't come from a lived experience that made you come to that conclusion through a different means.
Yes, that is very true. Well, and if I'm being totally honest, through architecture, the study of and the practice of, I sought to and was able to get in touch with more of my own roots as a Black person that I wasn't able to have access to as a young Black kid growing up in white suburbia. The work has not entirely been selfless. It has also been very much about enriching my own experience, but also about giving back, right? So I think the reason I bring up my focus from early on is that, like, I knew that I wanted to change lives through architecture. I knew that I wanted to support, in kind of the largest conception of the idea, the community that I was from and lifted up by as a young Black person, including the sacrifices made by my parents to get me to this place where like college was an important thing to actually do. I think that because of the focus that I had in what I wanted to achieve through architecture, that became a fairly singular lens for me regarding the choices that I made to ensure that I would get to do the things that I wanted to do. And the reason I bring that up, like, if anytime that I have the chance to like speak to a class of like undergraduates or graduate students or even K-12 students, I like to talk about the fact that you shouldn't wait for a tomorrow that you're never going to get to. Like, you should, whatever it is that you're passionate about, you should lean into it right now. Not because the future is uncertain, although that is true also, but because there is no time to wait. I think that for anybody that's listening that's interested in planning, architecture and planning, community planning, whatever it is, find the opportunities to dip your toes into those waters now, not only because it gives you an opportunity to test out the theory of what you're interested in, but also because it will help you to begin to build a portfolio that can be leveraged as you seek to make a transition into the practice that you want to be in. So by volunteering my time, by joining the historic Seattle Council, like I built up experience and I also built up relationships that then that I was able to leverage into additional civic work, additional civic opportunities, which you can connect the dots into how my interests and my work led me to the job that I have today. None of this was by accident.
And one of the reasons why I ask is I see the next generation coming out of school wanting to have such a greater social impact on the communities around them. So I feel like there are more to the benefit of our future that more younger people are really considering what that path is. I guess my question to you is, honestly, how many architects do you see in your role?
Not a lot.
Not a lot. So this is still a place where you could either look at it as an opportunity for architects to raise into, but I think it also means that there is going to be an education and a requirement. How do we encourage that? But also, how do we make way for more architects in public servant jobs?
So interestingly, I just accepted the opportunity to become an affiliate instructor at the University of Washington College of Built Environment. And my first seminar, so it's 10 2.5-hour classes, will be around what is planning, what is community planning. It will be to a multidisciplinary audience. The affiliate instructor position is co-affiliated with both urban planning and architecture. I think the reason that I bring that up is because I do think that education is changing, in part very much in response to what you're suggesting. Our next generation of leaders in design are more interested in social well-being, reform, social justice, and action than what the profession looked like 50 years ago. And so what we do at our universities, both in undergraduate and in graduate and in research, and like the connection between like design and policy and the decisions that get made on high that affect the regulatory framework that we all have to work within. I do think that what we expose both young professionals and young students to that is related to the profession of architecture continues to need to evolve. It's complicated, right? There's so many different ways to be in architecture. Like you can talk about biophilia, you can talk about planning, we can talk about climate change, and we should be talking about all of those things. So there's a bias that I have. I think that 50 years ago, most of our colleges and universities that taught architecture and design, the focus was on the practice of design, like with a capital D, and lots of red cape architecture. I think that now the more impactful reality is what is the connection between design and policy, how cities, counties, municipalities work. How do we serve people through the architecture that we build? And that has a lot more to do with vision at a 50,000 foot level, and then how does it get applied to a single site solution? But that it requires a totally different mindset and a different way of working. It's about public-private partnership. It's about what's the tax base. It's about who are the administrators that support the projects that we want to see happen. Well, and it's about finance. It's about bank practices. It's about co-ops. It's way more, dare I say, complicated than it used to be, which in my mind is also way more interesting and exciting. But it does mean that you need to be intentional about what you're interested in and lean into that selfishly. And it also means like you have to choose the area in which you want to become an expert, because you can't really be an expert in everything. There's just too much.
So I think you talked about the pipeline from an education standpoint, but I also think there is an education of current municipalities about the strength between design and policy that needs to be happening. So as somebody who works with a lot of architects that are interested, that are later in their career and interested in that engagement and have started to establish the connections that you did in cities, how do we support the education on that end to enable there to be more city architects in our cities?
So I think that the reality is, in the same way that coming into architecture on the front end, very much in my head was the idea of most people don't understand what architecture is, why it matters, or how it affects them, full stop. That is the same as it relates to this conversation that we're having around municipalities. Most of our elected officials and most of the constituents that they serve do not know what architecture is, do not know what its impact is, or why they should care about it. So I think that the only way that you get there is through positive outcomes. So I can go back to the Climate Pledge Arena example. I can talk about the artists that we brought in that became a part of the built product. I can talk about how the community was engaged in the design process. I can talk about the transformation of public spaces where you don't have to pay a ticket to experience the beauty and vitality of that space. I can talk about the transformation of the neighborhood. All of that happened through a design process and an investment with a developer and a collaboration with a city. Super complicated, but the outcome was because of architecture. And I think the more that we can, do that good work, but then also document and tell those stories, particularly to our decision makers and public officials, the more they can see, wow, we just transformed an entire neighborhood of the city that we would not have been able to do had we not invested in this big visionary idea and project. And that only happened because we had this architecture team do it and engage these developers in the process. We need to do more of that work, more of that storytelling. We as architects need to volunteer on all the civic committees, the transportation civic committees, the lighting of interstates through urban areas committees, the taking down of, I'm thinking of projects that we work on in our office. We have 2 Reconnecting Communities grants right now to explore how we can transform urban fabric by readdressing highway systems that are urban blight. As architects, we need to do more of that work, which then, by the simple nature of it, connects us to more administrative staff that work in government that then have influence on electeds that then elevate the need and value of the practice of architecture, and how design can provide a positive impact on the development of policy and policy decisions that then have a positive impact for people.
Hi, Disruptors. Thank you for joining us today on an episode of Practice Disrupted. If you like the content for today's show, you can find all of our past episodes over on practiceofarchitecture.com/podcast. Be a part of the conversation by joining me, our speakers, and other disruptors in our community at practiceofarchitecture.com/community. Our social media handle is Practice of Arch. That's Practice of ARCH. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to drop us a DM and say hello. Tune in next week for a new conversation on change in the profession.